The registration was in the glove box. Nora knew that. She also knew her hands were shaking and she didn't want him to see it. "Ma'am," I said, "license and registration." "I heard you." She didn't look at him when she said it. She kept her eyes on the middle distance through the windshield at the overpass ahead where a busted halogen lamp flickered against the wet concrete. It was 10:43 at night on a Tuesday in late September, the kind of night that didn't cool down, just got darker and more humid, and the inside of her Civic smelled like the fast food bag she tossed in the backseat 4 days ago and kept meaning to throw out. Officer Dale Prout stood beside her door with his flashlight angled at her face rather than her lap, which wasn't procedure and they both knew it. He was tall without being imposing in any physical way, the kind of tall that came from standing at an angle, one hip cocked, like he'd learned early that height alone could carry a room. He had a gut now that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His nameplate was clean. His brass was polished. He smelled like cigarettes and the particular brand of cheap aftershave they sold at the Walgreens on Clement Avenue. "You have a problem with the way I'm speaking to you?" he asked. "No, sir." "Then look at me when I'm talking to you." She looked at him. She kept her face even. That part had taken practice, not the composure itself, but knowing exactly how much of it to show, enough that she didn't appear to be baiting him, not so much that she disappeared into compliance. There was a narrow corridor between those two things, and she had learned its dimensions in the way you learn the layout of a house you've lived in for years, by feel, in the dark. "License," he said again. She handed it to him. Her right hand was steadier than her left, and she was glad for that. He took the license without looking at it and held the flashlight at the side of her face. Not the document, her face. He was studying her the way men study women they've already decided something about. "You come from Delwood tonight." "I work in Delwood." "What kind of work?" "Paralegal, Tucker and Reese on Magnolia." Something moved across his expression then, not quite a flinch, not quite interest. More like a file cabinet drawer opening half an inch and then being pushed shut again. He looked down at her license finally. "Nora Vásquez," he read, like he was reading a menu item he hadn't decided about yet. "Yes." "You know why I pulled you over, Nora?" She noticed he dropped the ma'am. "You said my brake light." "Left rear, it's out." It wasn't. She had checked her lights 2 days ago in the parking garage of her building because she had learned, in the way you learn things that cost you, to leave no openings. The left rear brake light was functional. She had a photograph on her phone, time-stamped 7:18 p.m. on Sunday, showing exactly that. "I'll get it looked at," she said. "I'm going to need to ask you to step out of the vehicle." She was quiet for 2 full seconds. "Am I being detained?" "I just told you to step out of the vehicle." "I understand that. Am I being detained or am I free to go?" His jaw moved in a way that had nothing to do with speaking. He put one hand on the roof of her car. The flashlight went to her eyes briefly and then down to her lap, checking, and she understood what he was looking for, a phone out, recording. There was no phone visible in her lap. She watched his shoulders ease slightly. "Step out," he said, "now." 3 months earlier, Nora had moved back to Breckenridge Parish. That was what everybody still called the surrounding county, even though the official municipal absorption had folded it into the greater Millhaven city limits in 2018 to take the job at Tucker and Reese. She'd spent the previous 4 years in Atlanta working for a firm that did insurance defense, and before that she'd done 2 years at a nonprofit in New Orleans doing expungement work, and she was 34 years old and had a student loan balance she no longer allowed herself to look at directly. Millhaven was not where she'd wanted to be. Her mother was here. Her cousin Renee was here. The rent was manageable, and the job paid better than anything she'd found in Atlanta after the last round of layoffs. She'd found a 1-bedroom apartment in the Fillmore district, which was a neighborhood that had been called several different things over the decades, each new name a thin coat of paint over the same structural problems: cracked sidewalks, a corner store that served as the de facto neighborhood hub, a recurring problem with flooding every time it rained hard, and a particular concentration of late-night traffic stops on the 4-block stretch of Olmsted Avenue between her building and the Sunoco station. She'd noticed the stops within 2 weeks of arriving. She was a night person. She did her grocery shopping late. She drove home from her mother's at 11 or midnight, and she'd seen it enough times that it stopped being background noise and became a pattern. Same blocks, same kind of car, same demographic of driver being walked to the shoulder. She'd mentioned it to her colleague Desta, who was 30 and had grown up in Millhaven and who had the patient, measured tone of someone who had explained the same thing too many times. "That's Prout's stretch," Desta said. They were eating lunch in the small conference room on the second floor, the one with the broken blinds that everyone pretended were fine. "He works the third-floor residential zone, has for years." "What does that mean?" "It means he does what he does and nobody's done anything about it." Desta was quiet for a moment. "You want to know the worst part? Half the time he's not even on duty when he does it. He comes back through that zone on his personal car, uses the badge." Nora had been a paralegal for 8 years. She'd worked expungement cases and insurance fraud and civil rights adjacent litigation, and she understood, in the clinical architectural sense, how systems failed. But there was a difference between understanding a system's failure and being inside its blast radius. She started paying attention differently after that. She began keeping a notebook, a physical one, a composition book she'd bought at the CVS because physical documentation had a different evidentiary weight than digital notes if it ever came to that. She wrote down dates and times when she saw stops on Olmsted. She began recognizing the vehicle, a dark blue Ford Explorer, personal plates, a small dent in the rear passenger panel. She noted Officer Prout's schedule from the publicly posted shift logs on the department's community portal, cross-referenced it with when she saw the Explorer on Olmsted, and found something she'd half expected to find. The stops happened most frequently on his off hours. She didn't do anything with that yet. She was a paralegal, not an attorney, not an investigator. She understood the boundaries of her standing, and she wasn't interested in becoming a cause before she understood what she was dealing with. But she bought a dashcam. One of the decent ones, a Vantru N4, front and rear and interior, with GPS logging, a motion-activated parking mode, and a screen that was small and flush-mounted enough that you didn't notice it from outside the car. She positioned it in the upper corner of her windshield, half obscured by the rearview mirror's shadow. She ran the power cord along the A-pillar trim. She calibrated the angle to capture the driver's window. She did this on a Saturday morning in her building's parking structure, unhurried, the way she did most things. Prout had been on the job for 19 years. He'd come up during the period before body cameras became mandatory citywide, and that meant the first decade of his career had hardened into habits formed in an environment where his word was the only record. He was not, by the department's internal metrics, a bad cop. He cleared cases. He had a decent relationship with a few of the longtime residents in his district. He'd coached a youth basketball team for 3 seasons in the early 2010s, and there were still photographs on the precinct wall from that era. Prout kneeling at half-court in a gym that smelled like floor wax, a row of 12-year-olds in mismatched practice jerseys, everyone smiling. He'd been married? He wasn't anymore. The divorce had been 4 years ago and had cost him the house in Westfield Terrace and a custody arrangement that meant he saw his daughter every other weekend. He had credit card debt he managed through a particular form of motivated not thinking about it. What he developed over 19 years was a refined sense for friction and its absence, for which situations would develop complications and which would not. He had a category of stop he'd made comfortable: young women driving alone in certain neighborhoods in certain kinds of cars. Not because he was predatory in any cinematic sense. He would have rejected that characterization with something resembling genuine offense. He'd built a narrative about it that was almost coherent. He was providing an education, a heads-up, a reality check that the law was real and had reach, that some women needed reminding they were not as safe as they believed themselves to be. This narrative did not survive scrutiny, but it didn't need to. It only needed to survive the 30 seconds between the thought and the action. He'd been doing it long enough that he'd stopped being careful. That was the thing about comfort, it looked like confidence from the inside. Nora stood on the shoulder of Olmsted Avenue with the guardrail pressing against the back of her calves and the sound of the interstate overpass amplifying the distant engine noise into something like a low, continuous exhalation. Prout was behind her and she heard him moving but did not turn around. "Hands where I can see them." "My hands are at my sides." "Put them on the vehicle." She placed both hands flat on the roof of her Civic. The metal was still warm from the engine. She could see in her peripheral vision the interior of her car through the driver's window, and she could see the small amber light on the dashcam, not the record indicator, the GPS lock indicator, which was steady and green. The record indicator was on the opposite side of the unit, facing the rear of the car, invisible from outside. The dashcam had been running since she'd turned the car on at 9:58 that evening, leaving the parking lot of Tucker and Reese after staying late to prep deposition materials. Pruitt ran his flashlight along the interior of the car through the passenger window. She heard him trying the rear door handle, locked, and then coming back around the hood, and she tracked his movement without moving her head. "You have any warrants?" "No." "Suspended license?" "No." "You been drinking tonight?" "No." A pause. "You're welcome to administer a field sobriety test." He didn't respond to that. She heard him take a breath through his nose. "I'm going to need to search the vehicle." "You don't have consent to search my vehicle." "Ma'am, I don't consent to a search. If you have probable cause, you can articulate it. Otherwise, I'm not consenting." The silence after that was about 5 seconds long, which felt different from a 5-second silence in most other contexts. It had weight in it. "Where'd you learn to talk like that?" he said. "I work for attorneys." She felt him decide something. She didn't know yet what it was, and she focused on keeping her hands flat on the roof, on breathing at a normal rate, on not letting her shoulders do the thing they wanted to do, which was pull up and in. "I'm going to write you a citation for the brake light," he said. "You'll want to get that fixed." "Of course." He went back to the Explorer. She heard the creak of the door and the chunk of it closing. She didn't move from the roof of the car until the citation landed in her hand, which took 11 minutes, and during those 11 minutes she watched 3 cars pass on Olmsted without being stopped. None of them had any visible equipment violations. All 3 of them had white drivers. She signed the citation. She drove home. She uploaded the dashcam footage to her encrypted cloud storage account before she changed out of her work clothes. The brake light citation was returnable to Millhaven Municipal Court within 30 days. Nora took it to Desta the next morning, set it on her desk, and sat down across from her without saying anything. Desta looked at it. She turned it over. She read both sides. "You document it." "I have the dashcam footage. I have the timestamp. I have a photograph from Sunday showing the light is functional." "Did he touch you?" "No." "Say anything that was." "Not on paper, no, but the stop itself, the duration, the search request without stated cause." Desta put the citation down carefully and looked at Nora in the way people look at something they're calculating the weight of. "You want to fight the citation." "I want to fight the citation." "That'll put you in front of a judge who golfs with half this precinct." "I know. And it'll get back to Pruitt." "I know that too." Desta nodded slowly. She had the kind of face that showed what she was thinking without being transparent. There was a layer of processing beneath the surface that you could see working but couldn't read directly. "We're a civil firm," she said. "Tucker and Reese doesn't do municipal defense." "I know what the firm does." "I'm not saying no, I'm saying it can't go through the firm officially." "I'm not asking it to." Another pause. "You want a referral." "I want to know who knows this courthouse," Nora said, "and I want to know who else Pruitt has done this to." The attorney's name was Carmen Holloway. She was 47, she had an office above a tax preparation service on Beaumont Street, and she had been litigating civil rights and police misconduct cases in Millhaven for 16 years. Her office had the particular atmosphere of a room that had absorbed a lot of difficult conversations. The furniture was mismatched but comfortable. There were too many files and not enough shelves, and the window air conditioner ran at a frequency that required you to raise your voice slightly to be heard over it. She watched the dashcam footage twice without speaking. She had a yellow legal pad in her lap and she did not write anything on it. "How long was the encounter?" she said. "From initial contact to when he gave me the citation, 14 minutes and change." "He tell you why he wanted you to step out?" "No stated reason." Search request. Did he say anything about smell, visible contraband? Nothing, just said he needed to search the vehicle. Carmen set the legal pad aside. She turned in her chair toward the window, the air conditioner rattled and went quiet for a second as a cloud passed over and the temperature shifted, and she was still for a moment in the specific way that people are still when they're moving something heavy inside their heads. His name's come up before, she said. Twice. Both times the complainants walked away before it became anything. One of them got her car impounded the week after she filed. Other one got a knock on her door from a patrol unit, official call, noise complaint from a neighbor, but the timing. But the timing, Carmen agreed. She looked back at Nora. What do you want out of this? I want the citation dismissed, and I want someone looking at him. Dismissal I can probably get you. The second part, she exhaled. That's not one dashcam, that's a pattern that takes time and it takes more than you. I've been keeping a log, Nora said, 3 months of dates and times. Carmen looked at her for a moment. You said you work for Tucker and Reese. Yes. How long have you been in that building? About 3 months. Carmen was quiet again. Then, all right, bring me everything you have. The citation hearing was scheduled for October 19th. 2 days before that, Prout pulled Nora over again. This time it was 8:20 in the evening, still light enough that the sky had color in it, the particular amber purple of a southern September dusk that made everything look slightly more cinematic than it was. She was on Olmsted heading north, and she saw the blue Explorer come off a side street and fall in behind her, and her chest got tight in a way that was physiological and immediate, and had nothing to do with guilt or the kind of fear that comes from wrongdoing. She reached for her phone without taking her eyes off the road. She opened the voice memo app she'd set up with a single large button designed for one-handed activation. She pressed it. She set the phone face down in the cup holder in a way that looked like she just tossed it there. The dashcam was already running. He didn't hit the lights for 2 full blocks, which itself told her something. He was deciding. She drove the speed limit, used her turn signal at the intersection, came to a complete stop at the sign on Harker Street, and when the lights finally came on behind her, she pulled over in the parking lot of a laundromat that was still open, its windows yellow and steamed, a woman folding clothes visible through the glass. He took longer to approach this time, 50 seconds, she counted. License and registration. Same phrasing, almost identical cadence. She wondered if he was aware of it. She handed both without comment. He looked at the license and she watched his eyes, and there was a moment, brief, controlled, but real, where she saw him process that it was her again and make a decision about what that meant. Ms. Vasquez, you live around here. On Fillmore. Where you coming from? Work. Same job. She turned to look at him then. Yes. He nodded slowly. He was doing something she'd seen before in deposition prep, the way a hostile witness creates a pause that's meant to feel pregnant, to imply that they know more than they're saying, to make you feel watched. It was a technique. It worked on people who weren't familiar with it. You got a hearing coming up, he said. She felt her heart rate change. She kept her face where it was. The citation, he said, municipal court, you retained counsel. That's not something I'm going to discuss with you. I'm just making conversation. No, you're not. He let that sit. He handed back her license and registration. He looked at the laundromat, at the woman in the window, at the sky. Everything looks good, he said. Drive safe. He walked back to his Explorer. She sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes after he left, not because she was shaken in any way that would have satisfied him, but because she needed to go over the interaction in her head before it faded, needed to file it in the right sequence, needed to make sure the voice memo had captured everything clearly. She uploaded the recording when she got home, then she called Carmen. He mentioned the hearing, Carmen said. By name, citation, municipal court. He looked you up. Had to. A pause on Carmen's end. That's either very stupid or it's a message. I think it's both, Nora said. Carmen filed for dismissal on October 18th and included a motion challenging the basis for the initial stop. She kept it narrow, factual, and dry. Deliberately, she told Nora because the goal was to win the citation and preserve the larger complaint without telegraphing it. The dismissal was granted 2 weeks later by Judge Winifred Aucaffer, who had a reputation for low tolerance of paperwork deficiencies, and whose courtroom moved at a pace that suggested she had better things to do. The officer had failed to document the specific equipment violation with any corroborating notation, and given the opposing documentation, the photograph, the GPS timestamp, the dashcam footage, the citation was thrown out in 6 minutes. Pruitt wasn't in the courtroom. He'd sent a union rep who said nothing. Nora sat in the courtroom gallery for 20 minutes after the hearing ended, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to let the adrenaline metabolize in a controlled environment before she drove. She was aware that this was not a win in any meaningful sense. It was a procedural correction to a fabricated citation issued by a man who had 19 years of practice at avoiding consequences, and the courtroom win would register to him as either a nuisance or a provocation, and she wasn't sure which one was more dangerous. Carmen met her in the hallway outside the wood-grain-paneled double doors in the fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly unwell. "Good outcome," Carmen said. She was already holding her next file. "But Nora, listen to me. He knows your face now. He knows your name. He knows you fought it and won. I know. I need you to tell me if anything changes, anything. If a patrol unit runs your plates, if you get a knock at your door, if anyone from the department contacts you for any reason." "I understand. I mean it, the moment this goes quiet is usually the moment something else starts." Nora nodded. She understood exactly what Carmen meant. November came in cold and dry, which was unusual for Millhaven, and the city had a stripped-down quality. It didn't always have trees bare, the light thinner, the long sightlines through the intersections making everything feel more exposed. Nora worked. She came in early, stayed late, went to her mother's on Sunday nights for dinner, drove carefully, documented everything. She began to feel the specific weight of being watched without being able to confirm it. A patrol unit sitting at the end of her block 2 evenings in a row. A car she didn't recognize parked across from the building entrance for 3 hours on a Thursday. She wrote it all down. She told herself that not everything was connected, and also knew that in this specific situation more things probably were than weren't. Carmen was building the larger complaint. She'd been in contact with 2 other women, both of whom had documented interactions with Pruitt, one of whom had eventually spoken to an investigator from the department's Professional Standards Division 3 years earlier and had received a form letter stating the complaint had been reviewed and no further action would be taken. That woman's name was Shonda Curtis. She was 41, she drove a school bus, she had a way of describing the stops she'd experienced that was so precisely detailed it was almost painful to listen to, because the precision was itself a kind of evidence. It was what people's memories did when they kept returning to something they'd never been able to put down. Carmen put Nora in touch with Shonda. They met for coffee at a place on Beaumont Street, not the one near Carmen's office but one 3 blocks east, because Nora had started to think about sightlines. Shonda came in wearing her bus company jacket and ordered a large coffee and milk and sat down across from Nora and looked at her the way people look at someone they've been told they should trust but haven't decided about yet. They talked for an hour and 40 minutes. By the end of it, something had settled between them that didn't need to be named. "There's a third woman," Shonda said. "I don't know her, but I know she filed a complaint internally and it went the same way mine did." "You know her name?" "No, I heard it from someone who worked in records at the 2nd Precinct. She left the department a year after." "The third woman filed or the records person?" "The records person. She left because—" Shonda paused, turned her coffee cup in her hands. "She said some complaints were getting pulled before they got logged, not all the way erased, just rerouted, put in a different file, filed under a different category, so they'd never show up in a search for Pruitt's name." Nora sat with that for a moment. She heard the coffee shop around her, the espresso machine, the low music, a man 2 tables over laughing at something on his phone, and she thought about the architecture of that kind of protection, how much it required, how many people had to touch it and say nothing. "Does Carmen know about this?" she asked. "I told her last week." "What did she say?" "She said it meant we needed federal eyes." Carmen's contact at the U.S. Attorney's office was an assistant U.S. attorney named Robert Fitch who handled civil rights matters, and who had the affect of a man who had been in rooms where things went wrong so many times that he'd calibrated his reactions to a permanent low setting. He was thorough, deliberate, and when Carmen brought him the full file in late November, quiet for a long time. "How current is the dashcam footage?" he asked. He was looking at Carmen, but the question was directed at Nora. "Most recent is from October, 2 separate stops. The second one where he mentions the hearing, do you have an uninterrupted chain of custody on that recording? Uploaded to encrypted cloud storage within 40 minutes of the encounter, the file metadata is intact. And the voice memo, same device, same account. Same account, I can pull the upload logs." Fitch nodded. He had a legal pad, but like Carmen, he hadn't written anything on it yet. "I want to be honest with you about the timeline," he said. "If we open a federal investigation under color of law section 242, it takes time, it takes resources, and it requires a pattern, not an incident. What you have is strong. What you have is also 2 stops and a circumstantial intimidation. I need more." "He tampered with internal complaint records," Nora said. "Allegedly, through a second-hand account from a former department employee who may or may not agree to talk to us." "She'll talk," Carmen said. "Her name is Diane Pregian. She lives in Covington now. I've already spoken to her." Fitch looked at Carmen. "Since when?" "Since Monday." He exhaled through his nose. It was not quite a laugh. "All right," he said. "I need Diane Pregian's statement on record with documentation if she has any. I need the original complaint files, the ones she says were rerouted. And I need you," he looked at Nora again, "to keep documenting. If he makes contact with you again in any form, official or otherwise, I need that on record." "I understand. Ms. Vasquez?" He leaned forward slightly. "I want to be clear about something. If this goes where I think it goes, you're going to be a key witness. That means there's a period, and I can't tell you how long, where you're exposed, where he may escalate before the investigation reaches a point where we can act." Nora nodded. "You need to think carefully about whether." "I've thought about it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. Prout knew something had changed, though he couldn't have articulated exactly what. He felt it the way certain people feel weather as a pressure change, a shift in the quality of the air rather than anything he could point to specifically. The citation dismissal hadn't bothered him. Citations got dismissed. It was the way it had been dismissed. Winifred Ockhafer was not a political judge, and she didn't throw things out as favors. She'd thrown it out because the paperwork was airtight on the other side, and that meant the woman had come prepared before she'd even hired an attorney. He ran her name through the department's access portal twice in November, which he shouldn't have done but which he'd done for small reasons his whole career, because in his experience the portal existed partly for that purpose regardless of what the official policy said. He found nothing of particular interest. She had a clean record. She'd had a parking citation 3 years ago in Atlanta that was satisfied. She worked for Tucker and Reese and had previously worked in New Orleans doing legal nonprofit work, which told him she was probably the kind of person who knew exactly what she was doing when she asked if she was being detained. He told himself it was nothing. He was a more careful person than he was 3 months ago, and that was enough. He told himself this while driving down Olmsted on a Tuesday night with no particular purpose, and he knew, at some level below the level where his self-narration operated, that telling yourself something was enough was exactly what not enough sounded like. He'd been short on cash for the last 2 months. The daughter's Christmas gift situation, the credit card bill, the transmission on his personal car that had started making a sound he was choosing to interpret as benign. None of this was Nora Vásquez's problem. He knew that. The fact that his mind kept routing back to her stop when it processed his financial stress was a symptom of something he wasn't going to name. He called his union rep on a Thursday. Fishing. Just asking in general terms about the complaint process, about how long a dismissed citation stayed in the system, about whether there was anything procedurally that could follow from an officer's failure to document an equipment violation thoroughly. The union rep said something that stuck with him. "Are you asking because someone's looking or because you're looking?" He said, "Just asking in general." The rep was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'd let this one go, Dale." He said he would. Diane Prejean was a 53-year-old woman who had spent 11 years in the records division of the Millhaven 2nd Precinct, and who had left without making noise because she needed her pension, and her pension required 2 more years of service, and making noise before the pension was vested was not something she'd been willing to do. She was not bitter in the theatrical sense. She was precise and quiet, and when she came to meet Robert Fitch in the conference room of his office in early December, she brought a folder that she set on the table between them without being asked to. The folder contained a series of handwritten notes, dates, file numbers, disposal notations, that she'd made over a period of approximately 18 months before leaving the department. She'd made them on her personal notepad, taken copies home at the end of her shift, and stored them in a box in her garage in Covington along with 3 other boxes that contained her daughter's school records and her ex-husband's tax files and things she hadn't thought about in years. She'd kept the notes because, and she said this simply, without drama, looking at a point slightly to the left of Fitch's head, she hadn't known what else to do with what she was seeing, and doing nothing at all had felt like participation, and so this was the middle ground she'd found. The file numbers corresponded, when cross-referenced with the department's redacted public complaint log that Carmen had obtained through a public records request, to gaps. The correct word was gaps, places where the sequential numbering of complaint files skipped, where the official record showed no complaint filed during periods when Diane's notes showed one had been received, logged, and then, on someone's authority, rerouted to a different categorical file. A file classified under unsubstantiated, no investigation required, that was retained in an internal system accessible only to precinct commanders and certain union liaisons. "Can you identify who authorized the rerouting?" Fitch asked. "The authorization signature on 2 of them is Captain Warren Hess," Diane said. "He's been precinct commander since 2016. Fitch wrote something on his legal pad. "The 3rd one," she opened the folder to a specific page, "I don't have the authorization signature. I only have my note showing the file number and the date it was received and the date it disappeared from the standard queue." "What's the date range on these?" "The first one is 2019, the last one I have a note for is 2021. I left in 2022. He nodded slowly. "Diane, this is good, this is useful. I'm going to ask you to give a formal statement, and then I'm going to ask you to testify if this reaches a point where testimony is required." "I'll testify," she said before he finished the sentence. The federal subpoena for internal complaint records from the Millhaven 2nd Precinct was served on December 14th. Nora learned about it from Carmen that evening. She was in her apartment, standing at her kitchen counter eating leftover rice from a container because it was 8 o'clock and she was tired, and Carmen's voice on the phone was controlled in a way that meant she was managing her own reaction to something. "It'll get back to Prout," Nora said. "Probably already has." "What does Fitch want me to do?" "Nothing different. Continue the documentation. Stay on your regular routes. Don't vary your behavior." She was quiet for a moment. "Carmen, if he does something." "If he does something, you call me, then you call Fitch's office. I'm sending you the direct number right now. Then you call 911 and you tell the dispatcher you are documenting the interaction and you request a supervisor be present." "You think that'll work?" Carmen was quiet. Outside the apartment window, Nora could hear the sound of a car slowing on Fillmore Street, and she went to the window without turning the light off. She thought about that for a second and then left the light on, because changing behaviors you'd established was itself a kind of information. And she was a person who understood that the data you broadcast was as important as the data you collected. The car on Fillmore passed without stopping. It was a rideshare, the app logo visible in the windshield. "I don't know if it'll work," Carmen said. "I'm telling you what to do if it happens." It happened on December 21st. Nora was 3 days from Christmas. She had a bag of groceries in her trunk, including a bottle of wine she'd bought for Sunday dinner at her mother's, and the temperature had dropped to 41 degrees, which was cold for Millhaven, and which made the night feel harder-edged than usual. She was coming south on Olmsted at 9:15 p.m., and she saw the blue Explorer parked on a side street with its lights off. She didn't slow down. She reached into the cup holder with her right hand and pressed the button on the voice memo app. She kept both hands on the wheel. He pulled out half a block behind her and didn't hit his lights for 3 blocks. She called Carmen. She got voicemail. She called Fitch's direct number, the one programmed into her phone as a contact titled RC Dentist, and got through on the second ring. "It's Nora, he's behind me. Olmsted heading south, no lights yet." A sound on Fitch's end, movement, a door. "Where are you exactly?" "Coming up on Harker, he's been following for about 4 blocks. Are you recording?" "Dashcam is running, voice memo is running. If he stops you, follow Carmen's procedure, request supervisor presence, stay in the vehicle unless he physically orders you out and you have no choice." "I know. I'm making a call right now." "Nora, is there a business, a populated area you can pull into if you need to?" "Laundromat on Olmsted, 2 blocks. Go there, don't stop anywhere without other people visible." The lights came on. She pulled into the laundromat parking lot. The place was open, 3 cars, the lights yellow-white inside, the same woman who'd been folding clothes 2 months ago, or a different one, Nora couldn't tell. She stopped the car, turned off the engine, put both hands on the steering wheel and waited. He took 90 seconds to approach. She could hear him, the sound of his boots on the pavement, unhurried. "Ms. Vasquez." "Officer Prout." He had his flashlight low this time, aimed at her hands on the wheel. "Step out of the vehicle, please. I'm requesting that a supervisor be present." A pause. "This is a traffic stop, I don't need." "I'm requesting a supervisor. I'd like you to radio for a supervisor before I step out of the vehicle." Silence. The laundromat hummed. Inside, a dryer tumbled. She could see through the glass that the woman at the folding table had stopped folding and was looking toward the parking lot. "You have anything in the vehicle I should know about?" Prout said. "I do not consent to a search. I am requesting a supervisor." "You're making this harder than it needs to be." She looked at him. "Officer Prout, I need you to know that I am recording this interaction. The dashcam is active. My phone is recording audio. I'm making this statement on the record." It was the first time she'd said it directly to him. She'd thought about the moment a lot in the previous weeks, the decision to reveal or not reveal. She'd decided that the reveal at this moment and in this context served a purpose, not to threaten him, to document his reaction. His reaction was a held stillness, maybe 3 seconds, then, "That's your right." "I know it is." "Step out of the vehicle." "Am I being arrested or detained?" "You are being detained for a traffic stop." "Then, I am requesting a supervisor be present before I comply with any request beyond providing identification, which I've already done." He looked at her for a long moment. The flashlight was on his own chest now, accidentally, and she could see his face clearly in the scatter light, not angry, not quite, but processing something at a rate that his expression was struggling to keep up with. He looked like a man doing math. He walked back to the Explorer. She heard him on the radio. She heard the codes but not the full content. She sat with her hands on the wheel and breathed and watched the laundromat window where the woman had gone back to folding but was still glancing out at intervals. The supervisor arrived in 9 minutes. Sergeant Irene Beaumont, who Nora did not know, who got out of her patrol unit and spoke to Prout beside the Explorer for about 2 minutes before approaching Nora's window. She was 50-ish, compact, with a sergeant's chevrons on her sleeve and the controlled expression of someone who had been called to a situation she didn't like the shape of. "Ms. Vasquez, Officer Prout has indicated you were pulled over for a taillight violation." "My taillight is functioning. I'd ask you to inspect it. I have documentation from 3 days ago showing it's functional and a prior citation for the same supposed violation that was dismissed in municipal court last month." Beaumont was quiet. She looked at the back of the car. "Do you mind if I check the light?" "Please." Beaumont walked to the rear of the car, pressed the brake pedal visually. She looked at Nora first, who pressed the brake from inside and then came back to the window. Her expression had changed in a small but specific way. "The light appears to be functioning." "Yes, ma'am." Beaumont turned and looked at Prout by the Explorer, who was looking at the street. She turned back. "I'm going to need to document this interaction. I'd like your contact information." Nora gave it to her. She uploaded the footage when she got home. On January 8, Prout was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The department released a one-paragraph statement that used the phrases consistent with standard procedure and no determination of misconduct has been made. The union released a longer statement. Local news covered it in a 300-word article buried in the Metro section. The federal investigation had been opened formally on December 22, the day after the laundromat stop. The complaint Sergeant Beaumont had filed internally, which she had, within 48 hours, in a document that cross-referenced the prior citation dismissal, created a paper trail that intersected in a way the department couldn't quietly manage. Prout did not know when he was placed on leave that the federal investigation had been building for 2 months. He knew about the internal complaint. He'd expected it. He'd told himself it was manageable, that complaints were manageable, that he had managed complaints for 19 years. He learned about the federal investigation on a Tuesday in February from his union attorney, who called him at home in the apartment he'd been renting since the divorce, and the call lasted 12 minutes. He sat at his kitchen table for a while after. He had a cup of coffee in front of him and it went cold while he sat there. His daughter had drawn him a picture at Christmas, a horse. She was 7 and in a horse phase that was taped to the refrigerator with a piece of green painter's tape, and he looked at it for a while. He was not in that moment thinking about anything he'd done. He was thinking about what was going to happen to him, which was a different thing, though he would not have said so. The federal grand jury proceedings spanned 5 months. Nora testified on a Tuesday morning in April. She wore a dark blue jacket and sat in the chair and answered questions for 2 hours and 40 minutes. She was not asked to narrate. She was asked to confirm, to identify, to characterize specific dates and interactions. She did this in the same way she did most things, without flourish, accurately. She was asked, toward the end, whether she had been afraid during any of the interactions she documented. She considered the question, yes. At which point, she thought about the laundromat parking lot. She thought about the first stop, her hands flat on the roof of the car. She thought about the nights in between where she hadn't been sure what was coming next. At several points, she said, but I kept the phone in the cup holder. The questioning attorney nodded and moved on. Dale Prout was indicted in May on 3 federal counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy in connection with the record manipulation, which tied him to Captain Warren Hess. Hess was separately indicted on 2 counts. Both men pleaded not guilty. The union issued a statement. The department issued a statement. A local advocacy group held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse, and Shonda Curtis stood behind a podium in the afternoon light and read from a prepared statement in a clear, measured voice. She did not raise her fist. She did not give a speech about justice. She said what happened to her, what she documented, what it had cost her, and then she folded the paper and stepped back. Nora was not at the press conference. She was at her desk at Tucker and Reese, going through deposition exhibits for a civil case that had nothing to do with any of this. Carmen texted her, "It's on the news, you okay?" She looked at her phone for a moment. She typed, "Yes, working." She put the phone down and went back to the exhibits. The trial was scheduled for the following March. Plea negotiations began in October and dragged through November. Prout's attorney reached an agreement in December on 2 of the 3 counts. The conspiracy charge was reduced in exchange for a proffer session, and the deprivation of rights count carried a sentencing recommendation of 14 to 22 months. Hess took a separate plea that included a fine and 18 months on the obstruction count. Neither plea agreement came with a public statement from the defendant. Nora learned about the Prout plea from Carmen on a Wednesday evening in mid-December, almost exactly a year after the laundromat stop. She was in her car, parked in her building's garage, when the call came. The dashcam was off. The garage was quiet except for the sound of the elevator arriving on the first floor and opening and closing without anyone getting out. 14 to 22 months, Carmen said. Federal sentencing, he'll be out in 14 if he. I know how it works. A pause, you okay? She thought about that question. It wasn't a question with a clean answer. 14 months was not nothing. 14 months was also not 19 years. The 2 numbers sat side by side in her head, and she didn't know what to do with that arithmetic, and she'd learned enough about herself in the previous year to know that not knowing what to do with something was not the same as not being able to live with it. I'm okay, she said. Shonda wants to know if you want to get dinner, the three of us, Carmen, Shonda, Nora. Yeah, she said, yeah, I'd like that. She sat in the garage for a while after hanging up. She could hear faintly the traffic on Fillmore through the concrete structure, the particular sound of the city at 9 p.m. in December, sparse and distant, like something that had been going on for a long time and would keep going on. A car pulled into the garage and parked 2 rows over, and a man got out carrying grocery bags and walked to the elevator without looking at her. She thought about Prout at his kitchen table. She didn't know about the coffee or the picture on the refrigerator, she never would, but she thought about him in general terms as a person sitting somewhere processing something. She did not feel sorry for him, she did not feel satisfied by him. He was a fact like the other facts, and the facts were that she'd been pulled over twice for a brake light that worked, and that she'd documented it, and that the documentation had gathered other documentation around it, the way certain things gather weight, not through intention but through gravity, through what they actually were. She put the car in park and took the keys out. She took the dashcam off its mount and put it in her bag, which she'd started doing because the dashcam was a thing of value and the garage was not fully secured. She'd bought it 14 months ago for $87 on a Tuesday morning after a conversation about a blue Ford Explorer and a pattern on Olmsted Avenue. She got out of the car. The elevator took her up. The light in the hallway was the same as it always was, fluorescent, slightly too bright, the second bulb from the door to her apartment flickering at irregular intervals in the way it had been flickering since September. A work order submitted and still pending in the building management system. She unlocked her door, she went inside, she set her bag down. Outside, through the window at the end of the hall she hadn't yet reached, Olmsted Avenue was quiet in the December dark. And